to have.
Well, let me tell our callers a little bit about your adult accomplishments as well. You know that Susan is the co-author of The Well-Trained Mind, but let me tell you also she went on to earn a Master of Divinity from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. She added Hebrew and Aramaic to her languages. In 1994, she completed the M.A. in English Language and Literature at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. Her concentrations were in translation theory, 17th century devotional poetry, and psalm paraphrase in the Tudor period. Since 1994, Susan has taught writing and American literature at William and Mary, where she has also done doctoral work in American studies with concentrations in history of American evangelicalism? Evangelicalism and the American novel. And I say this because your accomplishments are quite impressive. Can you list some other people that we might know about who were educated in the classical style?
Well, I think a lot of the authors that homeschoolers tend to look up to were because they were educated in an earlier era. You think of someone like Charlotte Mason. Think of someone like C.S. Lewis, who obviously went through the classical education. If you read his autobiography, you can see very clearly how he was led through these 3 steps. The writers of the early 20th century that so many homeschoolers respect benefited from this type of education because it was the pattern for both private and public education until progressive education began around the turn of the century and a little later, and I'm sure John Taylor Gatto had to say about that already. But this is trying to recapture an older pattern and to adapt it for the next century.
Can you give us an idea? What would a typical day be like for a homeschooling family who is using the classical method?
You know, I don't think there is a typical day for a homeschooling family, no matter what method they're using. We are all doing this because we are trying to shape our lives in the pattern that seems healthy to us. And everyone's families and children are so different. I mean, I can tell you that when in our house, I tend to, get the kids up in the morning, fix them breakfast, spend probably 2.5 or 3 hours in the morning doing their schoolwork, their history, their Latin. I always make them do their Latin first because otherwise it falls off the agenda. They're reading, they're writing, those liberal arts things that I am very passionate about. Early afternoon, my oldest son goes over to a neighbor's for tutoring in math. Then in the afternoons, usually my husband takes over so that I can do some of my writing, and he does their science with them. He does their phys ed. He does their spelling and some of the other subjects. But that's what works for us. I would think that what would be a constant for homeschooling families who are using the classical method is that the children would be spending a lot of time reading, sometimes on their own. Sometimes it doesn't look like you're interacting with them a great deal during certain parts of the day because you're teaching them how to learn for themselves. And the students are also spending time writing, even if very briefly, about each of the subjects that they're learning, again, because of this emphasis on reading and writing.
Of course, if you have a younger child, it's very easy to start out in the classical method because they can just kind of follow the suggestions in the book. Mm-hmm. But what do you do if you're starting in the middle or starting with an older child?
Well, whenever you're starting with an older child, you have to, I think, go back up and perhaps do remedial work in the skill areas where that child may be lacking certain skills. So if that child is uncomfortable with mathematical concepts or with mathematical operations, if that child is a reluctant writer, a poor speller, has no grasp on grammar, doesn't know how to structure a composition, if that child is perhaps not an eager reader, those are things that you have to go back and work on. So even with an older child, you may find yourself going back and working on some of those skills which are more, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, and work your way on back up. In terms of the content areas, what history are we studying? What literature are we reading? There's not a tremendous need to go back and sort of fill in the spaces there. You concentrate on building up their basic skills. Once you put a child's basic skills into place, you'll be amazed at the amount of self-education that goes on. My mother always says that we educated ourselves, and what she means by that is that she spent a tremendous amount of time with us, in the sort of under 10 and then on into maybe 11 and 12 a little bit, building those basic skills of reading and writing and being able to do mathematical operations and being able to think critically. And we spent in our late junior high and high school years a tremendous amount of time working on our own. She directed us, but we knew how to read, we knew how to write, we knew how to think. That is the point at which real learning begins, because the skills are now out of the way. They've become tools. They're not something you have to stop and struggle with. They're now tools that can be exercised on the content materials. So this is what you do. You go back, you fill in those skills that are lacking, and you don't say to yourself, oh, well, this is so basic, I've got to get this kid onto more advanced material, because unless you lay the foundation of the basics, you can't go on to more advanced material. You would be building on a foundation that's missing, and that's never a good strategy.
About how many hours a day does it take to homeschool your child in this classical method?
Depends on the child, depends on the age, depends on the family. I mean, I can tell you how much time my kids spend. My rising 13-year-old probably spends 4.5 hours a day or so directly on task. Probably another hour or so doing sort of peripheral things, a little bit of extra reading, messing around with his computer programming. That time is concentrated time. That's time that he is really focused on what he's doing. That still gives him plenty of time to be a kid.
What about classical schooling when you have multiple age children, you have more than one child?
Well, any kind of homeschooling with multiple age children is a little bit of a circus, especially if, your youngest is 3, which mine is. You try to, I think, order your day so that you can spend individual time with each child working on those skill areas, again. But you combine your content areas. You all do the same period of history. You all do the same science topic. Wherever you can with the content areas, you combine the kids into a group. And that, you hope, gives you the freedom to devote a little more one-on-one time to their skill areas, which are something that's much more difficult to combine. And if you're me, they eat a lot of Cheerios and cookies and things while you're working with the other kids. I decided we could either homeschool with 4 kids and do a good job, or we could avoid sugar, but we couldn't do both. So I am sort of the shameless bribing mentality when it comes to working with one child and keeping the other 3 occupied.
Your book, The Well-Trained Mind, can be a bit intimidating because it's so thick.
Yeah, it's big.
Do you have to homeschool in just this way, or is there kind of a simplified version of the classical method as well?
I actually think, I should say to start with, nobody has to homeschool in any particular way. I think most people who say that they are classical schoolers are taking a pattern and adapting it. I mean, if you can't take a pattern and adapt it, what's the point of homeschooling? You might as well just, put them in a classroom. The flexibility is what is great about homeschooling. With a book like ours, part of the reason why it's thick is because we're very specific. We're, describe particular curricula in great detail. Whenever you're very specific, you run the risk of being accused of rigidity, and people have to use this particular curriculum. Nobody has to use any of the curricula, in the Well-Trained Mind. The books that we describe we think are simple to use. Other parents may find them incredibly complicated and hate them. That's fine. I would hope that in the book what we've done is we've explained why we chose those curricula in enough detail so that parents can take the pattern and adapt it for themselves. That's the key, not being afraid to adapt. I mean, I'm always saying at conferences, there are no classical education police. They're not going to come and drag you away if you don't do it exactly like we do. Nobody does it exactly the same.
So not to be afraid to personalize it for your own family.
Absolutely.
Why do you divide the grammar, logic, and rhetoric stages the way that you do?
Yeah, there are a number of different ways to do this, and again, there's nothing canonical about any of them. There are classical educators who, let me tell you what we do for those who may not be aware. We put the grammar stage as grades 1 through 4, the logic stage grades 5 through 8, and the high school of rhetoric in 9 through 12. You will find classical educators who talk about a sort of pre-grammar stage, grades 1 through 2, and then they do the grammar stage a little later, sort of like 3 through 5. Then your logic stage is 6 through 8 or 6 through 9, rhetoric stage 10 through 12. The important thing to remember is that there is no one pattern that's going to work for every kid. Kids move from the grammar stage where they're very receptive but not very critical into the logic stage at different times. Not only do they do it at different times, but it's very common for a child to make the leap from grammar to logic in one subject but not in another. Kids' brains are made so that, they understand some better than others, and those are the subjects in which they're